Ladies and gentlemen, may I welcome you to this panel discussion. It's being held under the auspices of the Equal Rights Trust and the UCL Centre for Human Rights Law. We've been working together now for a few years, and we have here an outstanding panel of international experts on equality, and particularly on affirmative action, who are here to answer your questions. But I am heard last night that Jeremy Paxman has retired from Newsnight. Those of you who live in England will know who he is, after 25 years, and I've decided to take on the role of the Grand Inquisitor myself. And so I shall start off asking a few questions, give the panel an opportunity to answer, and then open each question to the floor, and you can ask supplementary questions and make comments. Now, I should tell you that the proceedings are being recorded, and the plan is probably to put them on the Equal Rights Trust website. If anybody has any objection to being identified or their question being recorded, please let the Trust know quite soon, so before that goes on. Last year it was put on and there were no objections, but if you don't want to be identified or whatever, let us know. May I introduce the panel, all of whom are trustees of the Equal Rights Trust, and we in the audience, there are too many of them to identify now, but we have several other trustees who I'm sure will take part in the discussion. Starting on my right, Dr. Gay McDougall, who's Distinguished Scholar in Residence at Fordham University School of Law, and she was formerly the UN Independent Expert on Minority Issues, and of course she's been very active in a number of human rights bodies in South Africa and elsewhere over the years. And then there's Helen Mountfield QC, a barrister at Matrix Chambers, who specialises in equality and discrimination law, and in particular has been the leading counsel in cases under the British public sector duty to advance equality, which I think would be of some interest to this audience. Then going to the other end, Judge Kate O'Regan, who was one of the founding judges of the South African Constitutional Court, served for 15 years and delivered many of its most important judgments on equality and on social rights as well. And then last but not least, Dr Dimitrina Petrova, who is the Executive Director of the Equal Rights Trust since its foundation in 2005, and she was formerly the Executive Director of the European Roma Rights Centre, and of course was, even before that, a very active human rights activist in her native Bulgaria. Now, we were supposed to have one other speaker, Professor Ted Shaw, but at the last minute he's had to call off because he's taking part in a very important televised discussion with Judge Sonia Sotomayor on American television tonight, and the time was changed, so he's not able to be here, and that's also a discussion on affirmative action, I gather. Well, why are we discussing this? I must say we were prompted by a headline of a leading article in The Economist magazine in April of this year, which said, "Time to scrap affirmative action, ? And that leading article and the supporting articles focused first of all on the United States Supreme Court in the Fisher case, which had to deal with whether the University of Texas's race-conscious admissions policies were lawful under the Equal Protection Clause. And I'm hoping Gay will say something about the outcome of that case. Ted Shaw was actually involved in the earlier leading decision of Grotto and Bollinger, which dealt with the admissions policy of the University of Michigan. The other country on which The Economist focused was South Africa, and it spoke about black economic empowerment, which is a method of transferring stakes in white-owned businesses to a new class of black investors who get preferences in state loans and contracts and so on, and an Employment Equity Act, which requires firms to be more representative racially and in gender terms. And this is The Economist was criticizing it as being a source of corruption, which left the majority of poor blacks unemployed. If you included those who are no longer looking for work, something like 40% are unemployed, as compared to only 7% of whites unemployed. So that was their focus. And then they turned to Malaysia, where there have been in the federal constitution preferences for the Bumiputra, the sons of the soil, and this federal constitution requires job reservation for Malays in the public service, scholarships, business licenses, and so on, stakes in businesses. And this has been criticized as obsolete. And indeed, the Equal Rights Trust itself did a report, which you can see outside if you want to get a copy, called Washing the Tiger, which is itself critical of this and suggests that the time has come to end this preference in Malaysia. And I should just say, although the article didn't deal with the United Kingdom, most people here will be familiar with the provisions of the United Kingdom, but let's just keep it in the background because we have an Equality Act, Section 158, which treats positive action as an exception to the equal treatment principle and allows it, as EU law authorizes, if it's a proportionate means of achieving any one of three objectives. Those are, first, enabling persons to overcome disadvantage connected with a protected characteristic, race or gender, whatever. Secondly, meeting the special needs of people with protected characteristics. And thirdly, enabling or encouraging participation, where the proportion of persons with that characteristic is disproportionately low. And we should also bear in mind there are provisions for reasonable adjustments for disabled people. There's another interesting clause which has been very underutilized, Section 159, which permits tie breaks where candidates for a job are as qualified as each other. You can then take into account the disproportionate lack of people of that particular group. And that would, I think, is a background, but we're looking particularly at the international side today. So I think we better really start with saying, well, what do we mean by affirmative action? And I'm going to put to the panel, the question is, what do you understand by affirmative action? Let me just, for a moment, suggest one possibility, and that is to distinguish between strong affirmative action, which includes quotas, reserved places, and so on, and weak affirmative action, no quotas, but encouragements, inducements, what's here generally called positive action. Example of strong affirmative action would be the quotas for women on company boards of directors, which they have, for example, in Norway and several other countries within the EU. And there was an EU draft directive which proposed a quota throughout the EU. While compared to that, the UK has turned itself against quotas and is trying to encourage more women on boards. And I noticed that over the past few years, the number of women, the proportion of women on boards of the FTSE 100 companies has increased from 12% to 21%, but hasn't yet reached the target for next year of 25%, still well below the 40% in other countries. That's just, I give as an example. So I'm going to put to, first of all, to Gay, what's your definition of affirmative action?
Well, first of all, let's not get tied up in semantics. There is, I'm going to talk primarily about international law unless I'm really asked about U.S. law to stand in for Ted. But under the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which has been ratified by almost every nation in the country, across legal systems, across cultural barriers, etc., it is quite clear that there's no difference between affirmative action, between special measures, which is the technical term that's used between temporary special measures, etc., concrete measures. The only language that's disallowed is positive discrimination because it's contradiction in terms. But anyway, under this convention, as well as under the Convention on Women, you've got to have, first of all, a finding, this is very important, that there has been discrimination and that it is unfair. So you dealt this formulation of does it create unfair advantage? Look, we start with a finding that society is, the situation in society is unfair and discriminatory. And the recommendation of the treaty bodies is that you do a thorough analysis using disaggregated data about the socioeconomic and other relevant aspects of the society. So you got an unfair situation to start with. And then you put together a program, and let me say that states are required. Bob, the only difference I would make, you've got legal obligations and you've got voluntary programs. I think that's the distinction you're making. But let's be clear that under international law, when there's a finding of this kind of unfair situation in societies, especially based on race, ethnicity, gender, etc., then the government has a legal obligation to put in place a program that will result over time in a corrective situation. So, the requirements are simply that the program be suitable to the aim involved, that it be temporary in nature, that whenever balance is restored, the program ends, and that it not give way to permanent special advantages, such as apartheid, not such as Malaysia, such as apartheid. So those are, it's not a big mystery. The law allows context-specific programming. It allows programming that is aimed at what is determined to be the real source of disadvantage and discrimination in your society. But the obligation is a universal one. So we're looking at creating substantive, de facto equality, and a situation in which all groups in society are able to enjoy and exercise their rights on an equal basis. And states have, discretion as to how they shape the programs. But there is an obligation to create a program and to go for the outcome of substantive equality. And yes, it must be temporary in nature. Now, over 180 government states have signed on voluntarily to this legal obligation. And treaty bodies at the international level, specifically, or primarily those working on race and ethnicity and caste, etc., and gender, work around the clock to push governments all around the world to meet this obligation of equality. That's what affirmative action, special measures, concrete measures are about.
That's very clear. Can I turn to Helen? Helen, what do you feel from a British point of view particularly?
I suppose the question is action for what? And I think what we're aiming at is substantive equality of opportunity.
No.
I think it's substantive. I think it's substantive equality of opportunity. You're not saying let's treat everyone exactly the same, let's ignore the barriers to equality of opportunity, but nor are you saying that because of historic disadvantage, we will just impose different outcomes. You're looking for substantive equality of opportunity, or equal enjoyment. I know that's the phrase that the European Convention on Human Rights uses. Article 14 says the duty of the state is to ensure equal enjoyment of the other underlying rights. So to work out what is the action you need to do that, well, you mustn't deprive somebody of equal enjoyment of those rights arbitrarily because of the colour of their skin or because of their gender, but you must look at, well, what are the barriers to equal enjoyment? And those barriers might themselves be disability or race or gender. So it seems to me that what you need is an approach that identifies the causes of inequality and disadvantage associated with a protected characteristic, and then addresses what must be done to remove them. And that's what I would say is affirmative action. It's a little bit like negative and positive approaches to human rights observance altogether. There's not just the requirement not to infringe someone's privacy and a sort of woollier duty to check that the state has got measures in place. They're really parts of the same coin, that unless you have the right structures in place to address what are the sources of disadvantage and what can we do about it, you won't then end up with substantive equality.
Thank you. I'm going to let members of the panel come back at the end of the discussion. Kate, would you like to comment on this?
Yes, I mean, from the South African example, one has to start with a constitutional framework, which makes it very plain that measures to provide redress for the inequalities that were the consequence of 300 years of colonialism and 50 years of apartheid are legitimate and in fact are to promote equality, are seen as part of equality, not as inconsistent with it. But 20 years in, if there's one thing we've learned, it's not an easy program. Undoing the legacy of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa is not an easy one, and I think to translate it into a British model, it would be a little bit like saying getting rid of a class system. In South Africa, we're talking about, if you look at babies born today, the colour of the baby's skin today remains a reliable predictor of that child's longevity, that child's education, that child's job opportunity, in ways that it did during apartheid. And some of that is because the state hasn't been as efficient as it should have been. Our education system is weak, and our healthcare system has not been as good as it should have been. But some of it is that social change is really hard, and it's particularly hard in a time of economic downturn, so it's very difficult. And so in some ways I think that we certainly haven't come to the end of the need for affirmative action. There's some really complex legal questions hinging around it. But I think it's important to frame this debate into realizing that where you do have deep patterns of disadvantage running along the lines of race, affirmative action in many ways is actually largely symbolic, because the deeper the disadvantage, the deeper the inequality, the less likely people are going to be able to benefit from an affirmative action program. An affirmative action program in a university, for example, is not going to be available to the 50% of South African young black schoolgoers who are never going to get a university entrance, not going to be even going to finish school, never mind get a university entrance. So it seems to me it's still necessary, but we shouldn't think that it's any kind of a panacea.
Thank you. Dimitrina, the Equal Rights Trust has a statement, a declaration of principles of equality. Maybe you'd like to say something about that in terms of our view.
Yes, back in 2008, we mobilized the effort of international experts on equality and human rights and ended up adopting this declaration, which was later supported by further experts, organizations, and so on. And while I agree with Gay that we should not be tied up in the semantics, I think it's necessary to, first of all, to agree that clarity is needed at the level of principle as well as at the level of national legislation. In 2007, when we started thinking of initially of how can we create a compendium of international equality law, we realized that that's not possible because there was a complete, it was a Babylonian, mess is so controversial. There was not one term that was understood across regions and jurisdictions in the same way. That the term discrimination was understood differently. In South Africa, you talk about that there is such a thing as unfair and fair discrimination. In the European Union framework, if it's discrimination, it's unfair by definition, and so on. There was not one term which was understood in the same way, and the same goes for affirmative action and positive action. And after much debate, we did achieve some kind of wording which we thought could be universally understood. And it was not just the wording which we achieved. We achieved what I believe was a good expression of a shifting paradigm in the framework of equality law. In my view, I don't know, Bob, whether you would agree, equality internationally, globally, equality law is in its infancy. You're talking about the UK, and that the UK is at the beginning of the 5th generation of equality law, and that is the case here, but internationally, this confusion, terminological confusion, or plurality, or this dissonance in the discourse is, I think, the result of a field which is still in flux. It's not built yet. It's not settled. This is one reason, and the other reason is the different origins of international human rights law and equality law in certain jurisdictions, where the terminology comes from different places and has not yet converged properly. So when we defined positive action, we chose positive action over affirmative action. We said, to be effective, the right to equality requires positive action. And then we went on to define positive action as a set of legislative, administrative, and policy measures which are aimed at compensating for past disadvantage or accelerating progress toward equality. Now, this is what we agreed, but I have to make one point to make it clear. Now, that is the way in which we understood the right to equality, and this was part of this paradigm shift which has been taking place. Now, we agreed to understand the right to equality as something broader and subsuming the right to non-discrimination. So, okay, the right to non-discrimination is the core, it's the backbone, but it's only one essential element of a broader right to equality. Now, if this is so, then in order to realize the right to equality, positive action or affirmative action is then not something which is an afterthought, which is a kind of an exception, which builds on otherwise equal treatment. It is an essential and required part from the very start of the right to equality.
Yes.
So there's no achieving the right to equality, because we assume that in essential ways there are inequalities which we want to overcome. In order to assume the right to achieve a right to equality, we have to build in positive action from the start. Otherwise, if not, then we will remain limited to a previous, more primitive conception of equality, which is that of equal treatment, understood as identical treatment. Yes. If we are to depart from that and have a right to substantive equality, then we have to assume that positive action is required, not just allowed. Yes. And just one last thing to add to that. The Equal Rights Trust now works in a number of countries, and wherever we're traveling, what we see around the world is actually not the problem about affirmative action, positive action, is not so much that it may be misunderstood and so on. It's important, but this said, the more important problem is the enormous abstention from positive action. Governments are simply not doing it. They may, as Gay said, be bound, legally bound. They they've been urged by treaty bodies, they're not doing it. They're not doing it.
Yeah.
And we hear again and again complaints exactly in this direction, that in fact, yes, it's in the books. We had this conversation with Joanna and our colleagues from the Solomon Islands, from the Pacific the other day. They say, well, there is a constitutional provision that there has to be, women have to be treated with a temporary privilege. I don't know, was it quotas or whatever, but they expected that for a number of years. Nothing's happening. So I think that's the bigger.
Okay, I'll let you come back later, Gay, if I may, because I'd like to open it up now. Let people ask one or two questions, and then we just take a group of questions, and then I'll come back to the whole panel, and you can make your point. So, questions or brief comments, and please just identify yourself when you speak.
Good evening, and thank you for your talks. My name is Michael Ezra. My question is, and you might think that this is a retarded question in some ways, but I've always felt that affirmative action itself is a racist thing, not because it sort of separates one group over another group, but because it looks at people based on a primary characteristic, which is, say, their race or their sex or any other things. So consequently, if it's a university application, this is a person, you're identifying them by being a woman or a black person or whatever characteristic, rather than as a human being. And I just think that this is relatively awful. And I'll give one straight example. I have a friend who was a school teacher in philosophy at a school in St John's Wood, and he told me one of his students who applied to a university, I won't mention it, but it's one of the leading universities in this United Kingdom, and it was in the Department of Law. It wasn't UCL. And the student was a black female student, and when she went to interview there, they seemed delighted. I mean, she came back to school delighted that she applied, and said to her that they were going to give her a very low offer, to get into the university because of her characteristics. And she was appalled, and she turned down the offer because of that characteristic. But I just think this whole thing in itself is racist.
All right, well, we'll hear from the panel about that in a minute. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions. Any other? Sorry, over there, Hugh.
A few comments. So picking up on what Kate Regan said, so in South Africa, race is a very good predictor of disadvantage. It's quite a lot more complicated, I think, in this country. But, I think probably the best predictor is postcode.
Postcode, right.
Is what?
Postcode.
Postcode, where you live.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yes. Could be white, could be anything. It's not
Class.
There's a whole range of factors there. And I think what was missing from the panel's discussion was gender affirmative action for whom? Are you going to have affirmative action
Yeah.
SE50?
You're anticipating a question I was going to put later, but
So I'm just asking for who, I think I can see in South Africa that's the easy question to answer. I think in Western Europe it's more complicated.
I think you've opened up the question, really legitimate question of whether it's right to identify people according to the 9 protected characteristics in the British Equality Act, or whether we should really be talking about socio-economic disadvantage or some broader concept linked to poverty, rather than fixing on these things. The way it's linked to the first question as well. Any other? Let me take one more question, then I'm going to open it to the panel. Yes.
Helen Mountfield QC. I was just interested in some of the discussion about the permissive nature of positive action provisions and to what extent the panel think that the public sector equality duty that we have in domestic legislation is or could be effective in making those permissive provisions more an obligation of the state.
Okay. Well, shall we just take those questions for the moment, and I can open the floor again. I'll start at your end, Kate. Do you want to comment on any of those?
I wanted to respond to your first question. I think there's a very instinctive way in which we feel using what should really be an irrelevant criterion as a criterion does, and I think also, well, certainly I feel like that in South Africa. It seems to be almost perpetuating an apartheid way of thinking about life. On the other hand, the brutal reality is that in fact is the predictor of a disadvantage. But the University of Cape Town has actually just in the last week adopted an admissions policy which seeks to effectively achieve what would be achieved by using race, but by using a range of considerations, not exactly postcode, but whether your parents and grandparents had university degrees, what your home language is, which is a very distinct, a definite African identifier, in order to get around exactly the sorts of issues you were saying. I understand them, but my feeling is that this is far too urgent a problem for us, or certainly in South Africa, for us to be able to ignore the fact that race, in fact, is actually the predictor of disadvantage in South Africa. It may be different elsewhere, but certainly I don't like it. And there is some quite unnerving evidence that suggests that it may have perverse consequences using race in terms of suggesting to school kids that they are not as good as other kids, and that if they're getting advantages that they ought to perform to, so there are worrying studies out there which do suggest that it's by no means entirely benevolent. In response to Hugh Collins' question, I'm sure that's right. Though even in South Africa, I have to tell you that although race is important, for example, under apartheid racial classification, there weren't just two racial groups. There were white South Africans, African South Africans, but also South Africans of mixed race, who from a political representation point of view are far more vulnerable. And there's in fact a very important case running through the courts at the minute as to how much benefit they should attain from affirmative action and how the democratic representation should work for them. So it's not straightforward. But I think you are right that one does need to ask. In the other thing I'd like to say about that, South African Constitution doesn't use race language. It talks about, in order to promote equality, measures that will address disadvantage that has been occasioned as a result of past discrimination are permitted or are encouraged or should be taken. So it talks in terms of disadvantage caused by previous patterns of discrimination. So wherever there is a pattern of discrimination which has produced it, and one could argue it, for example, on the lines of disability, I think. Differently abled people should be entitled to benefits of affirmative action, and we do see that in our labour law.
Thank you, Gay. I know you've got an comment on that.
Well, let me take the opportunity to speak on behalf of Ted. About the situation in America. But first of all, I think that you start, of course we don't want to be judged by any one criteria that, especially those that are immutable. But I think you start with a finding that is the basis for the discrimination. I mean, all of my life as an American, I've only been discriminated against based on some things that I cannot deal with, cannot change. The color of my skin and my gender. And so when society makes that decision first, then the obligation is that society must correct that. It doesn't mean that all the other aspects of your character are not taken into consideration. And it certainly doesn't mean that the other aspects of your characteristics of character aren't still important in your advancement through society. This is about removing a particular barrier that is odious in and of itself. You've got to address it straight on. But there are a lot of discussions in the United States about whether or not, adding different characteristics, as in South Africa, class, parentage, etc., to the mix, would be more popular, more acceptable, and certainly our Supreme Court is clearly moving in that direction. The Fisher case, which was decided last year by the Supreme Court, validated an affirmative action program that tried to do that. In Texas, this was a program that said, look, instead of saying that we're going to have a certain percentage of black students, et cetera, we're just going to take the top 5% of all high schools in Texas. And that, we think, is going to give us the racial diversity that we think is important. So the Supreme Court said, okay, that's fine. The problem with that is that it only works, in the United States if all the high schools are segregated. So it's on top of an odious system. In South Africa, the vast majority of the population are black. So, you can add other characteristics and still come up with a class of people or, entrance into employment that are richly diverse. In other countries like the United States, you cannot. The other point I will make is that, look, the reality is that in countries like South Africa and the United States, at least, you are trying to deal with situations that are really odious. I mean, slavery in the U.S. You can talk about my other characteristics, but that is the national problem. And there is an obligation to deal with that. And while there are class differences, and some people say, what about the creamy layer in India and that whole problem? Well, I bet to say that, my experiences in India have not led me to the conclusion that the creamy layer in India, those who have individuals who have benefited and become more wealthy, that they're not still facing discrimination in ways that are meaningful.
Can we come back to that particular point? I think it's a very important point about people who belong to a group but are not themselves disadvantaged by that particular characteristic. But I'd like to come back to that because I think it raises wider things. I wonder, if, Gay, if you'd like to just say something about the way in which the American Supreme Court is now looking, just briefly, how it's looking at the issues of affirmative action, particularly in relation to university admissions, and I think you wanted to say something also about decisions decisions by a majority of voters to stop it.
Here the Supreme Court now in the U.S. is 5-4 is the split. 5 have been consistently anti-affirmative action programs, 4 are more liberal. There was a major decision in 2003 that diversity programs based in education system at the higher level or at the university level, very important to they had an educational benefit for all students. So it's very important that, white students learn from students of other communities. So then they determined, as I said, in this Fisher case, that this program that's facially neutral is okay. Just a couple of months ago, there was a major decision that there can be an initiative on the ballot in a state like California and Michigan, and that decides that affirmative action programs based on race or what have you shall not be allowed. And the Supreme Court decided that that is valid, as constitutional. Now, that may well wipe out affirmative action that is race-based on its face. And as I say, in the U.S., it's been determined by many studies that if you don't make it race-based on its face, you're not going to get a racially diverse category, because Latinos and African Americans are minorities in the U.S. So, it may well be that we've got a major challenge and a stumbling block put before us.
Helen, I wonder if you might want to answer Melanie's question about positive duty, and also if you wanted to make any comparison with what Gay has been saying about the approach in the US.
Well, I think the problem is that the predictors of disadvantage in this country are much more multi-layered. So if I went back to the beginning, the equal ability to flourish and to enjoy what you enjoy without those irrelevant parts of you that you can't do anything about having an impact on it, I think then you have to ask, well, what are the things that stop that happening? And if it's a characteristic, like, for example, disability, and you say, what stops me coming into this room and getting onto this platform is that I have a mobility impairment and there's no ramp. Well, then you can say it's because you're disabled, it's because you have a physical impairment and there is no ramp that you can't get here. It's those combination of things. That's simple. When it comes to something like educational disadvantage in this country, the statistics are incredibly complicated. You can distinguish between a number of communities. Black boys are very much more likely to be excluded from school than any other group. Black Afro-Caribbean boys. There are real distinctions between different Asian origin populations in their educational attainment. And indeed, white working class boys are likely to have the lowest levels of educational attainment in some areas. So, yes, those predictors of disadvantage are multi-layered and overlapping. And things like postcodes are often seen as smarter ways of eliminating the disadvantage, which may, in some respects, be race-based or gender-based, but there's lots of bits to it. And I do think there are some very intelligent things that are done that are A, probably more socially acceptable here, but B, really will attack the root of the problem. So, for example, I'm aware of one university that does have postcode-based preference in its local areas which incidentally end up being disproportionately black by a long way. But then it's a multi-layered thing. So it's also about schools with their focused efforts are on areas and schools which don't have a high proportion of university entrants and or pupils who don't have university-educated parents. So they're looking at all the predictors of disadvantage and then trying to focus efforts, and they will give a lower offer to people from those target groups. It's not absolutely everybody who's disadvantaged in the country, but they'll say, well, if we focus on those particular groups in that particular area, and because they're local, it's a local area, we also put in place study programs and things both before and after university. That will be a smart and quick way of improving our diversity. So I think that probably there are more nuanced things that are needed to achieve equality in different places. And it's partly a question of the history of the place that you are and what the causes of disadvantage have been. I do think we missed a trick when we stuck with the relevant protected characteristics only in the Equality Act, and there was a provision about being able to take into account socioeconomic disadvantage, which was too politically controversial and was removed. But in fact, the protected characteristics are used as a proxy for social disadvantage. So when there was a legal challenge to the trebling of university tuition fees in this country, and part of the challenge was failure to take into account equality characteristics in a separate way. What about the impact on disabled people? What about the impact on women? What the government said was we did do an impact assessment about children from disadvantaged families, and that swept it all up. And actually they lost on that. They said, no, there are some specific disadvantages, for example, for people who are disabled that you should have looked at. But they were, in principle, because indirect discrimination or socioeconomic disadvantage also tends to affect people from particular racial groups, for example, or particular religious groups. If you focus on socioeconomic disadvantage, you're doing quite a good job often of addressing facially neutral measures which nonetheless disadvantage the protected equality groups. The public sector equality duty is. I'm not aware of anything. It may be supreme ignorance on my part, but I'm not aware of any other country that has something in quite the form of the public sector equality duty.
Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland, well, yeah. But, the public sector equality duty came into force because, well, it was a response to the Macpherson inquiry into the death of Stephen Lawrence, who was a black teenager where he and his family, well, when he was killed, the investigation into the crime, the assumptions made about the friend who was with him, the way his family were treated, were all different and disadvantageous because they were black. And that's what the Macpherson report found. It wasn't about individual racists, it was about the assumptions, the whole institution. And what Mr. Justin Macpherson said was that it's incumbent on every institution to examine their policies. So what Dimitrina was saying is that not just but their policies and the outcomes of their policies and practices to guard against disadvantaging any section of our community. So it's really a duty of inquiry. It isn't a duty of result, and that gets criticised, but it's a duty to give due regard to the need to advance equality of opportunity. And to do that, you have to say, well, what are the causes of disability? You can't give due regard to a need to avoid something or to promote equality if you don't know what the causes of inequality are. So it's a questioning duty. And once you've identified what the causes are or might be, then you have to look at what you might do to address it. And if you don't ask those questions, that's why I think it is criticising, but it can be then a source of, if you say, well, there are things that we could do and should do, if it's not reasonable not to do them, then you get to the point where you are acting unlawfully, because there are in some contexts duties to make reasonable adjustments or act in ways to avoid the disadvantage arising.
As you know, this having due regard has been heavily criticised because it is only a duty of inquiry, in effect. And it's suggested that, and was moved in Parliament by, I think, Lord Ouseley, that, but was defeated, that the duty should be a duty to take proportionate means to advance equality. In other words, a much more substantive question: has the authority, the public body, taken proportionate measures? Not did the authority have regard? I mean, but I don't think we can get into that debate here. But I think
what's interesting then is if it does then feed into the sort of discrimination, indirect discrimination in British terminology, or challenging a facially neutral measure that does disadvantage people. Because if you know what it is and you don't do so, then it's much more difficult. Or if you should know what it is and you don't do anything about it, it's much more difficult to say it's justified because you haven't thought about it. So it is a duty to identify.
I'll come back to you a bit later. Okay. And this is a very pressing. Can I just come back to you on that? I just actually want to turn to Dimitrina, because you said that there was, some countries they just say, well, it's in the constitution or it's in the law, but it is meaningless. Can you give us any examples of countries where this duty, positive action or requirements of positive action, have had a significant positive effect? Are there good examples, or is it nearly always just symbolic? Think about it. Anyone else on the panel? Can you tell us? Okay.
Well, I mean, I would say the United States has had very positive outcomes.
It has measurable outcomes.
It's had measurable outcomes in terms of education. It's been phenomenal in terms of education. In terms of low-wage, low-skilled workers in construction industries, etc., in all sorts of employment scenarios, the firefighters across the country. There's been remarkable outcomes in terms of getting African American and Latino firefighters, a profession in which you learn on the job. You don't have to. So I think that the outcomes have been very significant. I consider myself one.
Yeah.
So yes.
Okay.
Brazil, maybe. We have somebody from Brazil. South Africa, the United States, but these will be rather few. Why? Because too few countries have actually implemented any affirmative action programs at all. So we can just count them maybe on two hands. Not because there's not been enough experimenting. There are some worst practices. Malaysia, of course.
Well, can I just turn to that?
The good cases are too few, not because affirmative action is a bad thing, but because there's just little been done in too few countries.
Can I just take what the core question, the one in our title? Does it create unfair advantage? Now, the ERT report said it was creating unfair advantage for the Bumiputra. Would you like to just elaborate on that? Why the report says that it creates unfair advantage?
Well, where to start? So, I think that the important thing about affirmative action is that it should always be very strongly bound to the context, to the national context.
Yeah.
The national context will tell us, the analysis, the country-specific analysis will tell us whether or not affirmative action is working, when it has stopped working, and so on. In Malaysia, it started in theory with the constitution. In fact, it has it comes back from it comes from the British who had imposed something like a pre-affirmative action idea, privileging the Malay already in colonial time, and then the Malay had that in the constitution, but it wasn't really applied. There were riots and disturbances back in the 60s when, in fact, a law was adopted, an NEP, a national new economic policy, which introduced very strict quotas in a number of areas of life for privileging ethnic Malays over Chinese and Indians, who together make about 40% of the population. The idea then was that the Malay were economically disadvantaged, and there was an overlap, and these were the terms of that new economic policy. There was a strong overlap of ethnicity or race with economic disadvantage, and the purpose was to overcome that. So they started to implement those quotas in public sector employment, schools, universities, scholarships, ownership of equity in private companies had to be at least 30% Malay. Privileges in the housing sector, huge discounts in mortgages for private housing, and so on. A broad range of measures. Now, several decades later, there are two kinds of assessments, and there's no impartiality, it seems, inside the country. So inside the country, certain researchers say that by now the Malay are stronger, that affirmative action has worked. Moreover, in the last 10 years, they've become so much stronger that now affirmative action is simply and purely racial discrimination against the non-Malay, the non-Bumiputra. Actually, Bumiputra Malay plus Sabah plus Sarawak, so that it's a more complex category. As you said, the sons of the earth, not just the ethnic Malay. But in any case, some researchers say affirmative action has achieved its purpose and has outlived its legitimacy. Others say that's not true. So you see, it's very complicated because we know it's one of the criteria in international human rights law that affirmative action, at least when it comes to race and gender, let's not talk now about disability or age, but race and gender, has to be time-bound. Once the purpose is achieved, it has to be removed. And now, once, however, a group has become stronger, then then it's very difficult to withdraw the privilege. And now there is a controversy of whether or not this has happened. And as we know, economic statistics and measurement can be a hell of a difficult thing, and people can disagree for a very long time as to who is the stronger, actually. So at the moment, there is our research somehow was inclined to believe those studies, we took as more credible those studies who found that the Malay have been privileged now for some time, and therefore it should be this so-called affirmative action indeed is by now is only described, can only be described as racial discrimination, or what, if we use the language of the International Human Rights Instrument, it is a privilege. So it's racial discrimination defined as any distinction, exclusion, restriction of privilege, which, and so on. So it's a privilege which, by now.
You actually committed.
So we think, yes, we committed to say that by now it's a privilege which constitutes racial discrimination and has to be removed. The complication is that that nobody in Malaysia is allowed to say that, but because that's illegal. We could say that because we're in London, but our partners who endorsed us, actually the late Irene Fernandez, there were threats. She was charged with sedition because the law was so protective of affirmative action, and I have to say they call it affirmative action. It's not our pick of words. It's sedition. It's considered sedition to criticize. You cannot criticize.
Can I throw this open now to the participants here? Would anybody here like to suggest cases of unfair advantage? Tapan Pose, one of our trustees, Tapan Pose from Nepal.
I think, Dimitrina, we need to look back into the Malay experience a little more deeply, because I wouldn't agree that it was actually, or it can be defined as an act of affirmative action for the backward community. I think it was and is continues to be a nationalist resurgence and an assertion of the Malay community to, take over the goods of the state. And if you go into the history of those, you have similar phenomena seen then happening in Sri Lanka and many other places. So this kind of identity-based national resurgence, ethnicity-related demand for affirmative action needs to be looked into a little more seriously. But going back to the earlier question, I think there are many very serious advantages. India is one, where the Constitution created positive discrimination or affirmative action, reservation of quotas in jobs, in schools, in parliament, and everywhere for the backward caste and the what they call the scheduled tribes, effectively nearly 19% of the population, which have a double advantage. Of course, it is created, and historically it has remained a very, very contentious issue for the upper caste and others. It's still called the freebies and so on and so forth. But historically, if you look at it, had this affirmative action not been there, we wouldn't have had the backward castes and the tribal communities come up the way they have. And in fact, we have had many ministers, generals, very well-known scientists, doctors. It's all because of the fact that there has been a systematic application, though not 100%. But without that affirmative action, you wouldn't have had this historically disadvantaged people who have been discriminated. And this is where I want to just complete by saying that the very notion of equality is a positive right. It's an assertion of equality to deny a historic discrimination. So to define equality as the state, treating everybody as equal is not enough. Equality has to end discrimination, and that's a part of the right to equality. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other? Yes.
I'm Esther Ojinari. First, I just wanted to agree with Dr. Petrova on her point on Brazil, I think. Even though Brazil's very young in implementing affirmative action education, there is already evidence of successful cases in access to education for not just for Afro-Brazilians and indigenous, but also for looking at not necessarily class, but socioeconomic situation as well. So they have actually begun to look at that criteria. But I wanted to raise a point about another case in Colombia. I've just come back from research on Afro-Colombian rights. And there's a law in Colombia that enables 2 seats in the House of Representatives for black representatives of black communities. And in March this year, there was elections for the Congress. And the 2 people that won those elections were actually not black.
Who was the constituency there? Were they only black voters or were they everybody?
Anyone can vote for them.
Yeah,
They're
okay.
special seats. And the people that run for them have to be certified by black Afro-Colombian organizations. And the 2 people that ran, 70 people ran for these positions, and only the 2 people that got them were not black. So
but they were representative because they'd been voted, but they weren't the right colour. Is that
they
what
were
you're saying?
voted in, but a lot of the black movement is complaining about this because they shouldn't have even been able
But
to
they were,
vote
if there was an
after the
election, surely it was free. Can I take a question at the back there? You had one, and then there's one over there. Yeah,
thank you.
and one over there. Sonia, yeah.
I disagree with the comments about India, and I think that it's a bit more complicated than that. There are now 44 countries in the world with some form of affirmative action, including such examples as reserved seats.
But that's not national law and policy. That the hundreds and hundreds and thousands, if we talk about individual companies, universities, whatever, but if we take a whole country and a law covering national, then these are few countries. I think that's an important distinction to make.
Well, if you include the parliamentary reservations, if you include quotas for women, there are quite a few, and you include countries like Nigeria that has a very, complicated, elaborate system of inclusion. I think it falls within, the affirmative action mandate.
Before I come,
Can I just
yes.
There are 44 countries, of which 31 have also got cash transfer schemes.
Yeah.
And quite often, the 2 things get mixed up. Now, India is a prime example of that, where the laws about the scheduled castes and the other backward classes has actually led to demands for cash transfers or subsidies. And that is the way that equality is achieved, not by actually delivering equality, but by giving cash transfers and subsidies. And of course, in India, it has actually led to very, very violent responses in which many people died. And it was one of the factors, not the only one, which led to the creation of the Bharatiya Janata Party, which has now just come to power with an absolute majority. Now, one of the objectives of the BJP, although it's disguised very heavily, is to ensure that there never will be inequality in India, and to roll back all the equality programs which have been instituted since independence. The BJP is essentially a free trade, anti-equality party, but it's in disguised form, and of course, as we know, it also includes fascist elements.
Okay, thank you for that. Before I come to you, I just want Sonia Correa from Brazil, one of our trustees again. You would like to comment?
Yes, since Brazil has been mentioned, I think it's important to first reiterate what people in the panel have said, that context matters a lot, and always in affirmative action. Secondly, that as in the US, we have the legacy of slavery. We have the legacy of slavery, which is not easy.
The legacy of slavery,
It's the same in Colombia, and other places in Latin America, or Caribbean, English-speaking Caribbean. But as South Africa, race is totally intersecting with, in other countries, with social economic inequality, which makes things very complex, as in the UK. It's not as simple as that. And to add to that, we have, as Colombia, the history of miscegenation, which makes things yet much more complex if you define discrimination in strictly racial terms. Having said that, Brazilian programs are very young and new. Measures are still being adopted. Just recently, we adopted reserved seats for public service, just 3 months ago. But yes, we have positive results in education, yes, for university enrollment. We have very positive results in terms of the diffuse idea of cultural valuing the Black and the indigenous legacy, but we have also paradoxes. And I think that the main paradox is related to the question of refining or re-essentializing race. For example, there's one university in Brazil that has set up a committee to do racial screening of the students applying for the scholar grants for a university. Because Brazilian racial definition is self-declaration. So you declare yourself as Black or mixed or white, and that particular committee it's very problematic because it's putting race back into the scientific notion or phenotypical notion of race, and so I'm raising that because it poses a problem.
Yeah.
And we're trying to open that.
Yeah. So can I take your question now?
Well, it's really a common question, which I would like to tie up into comments and then get to something that Helen said about affirmative action. Now, India is an interesting case study because the first visibly affirmative action program that we have presented today came about in the late 19th century, in the past decade, and since 1950 we have a very strong affirmative action program in the higher echelons. So this is public employment, higher education, and reservation quotas. Now, I was listening to both speakers and you know, those are both truths in societal established causation and affirmative action policies. India has seen enormous political, enormous occupation of the political space by former untouchables, the Dalits, and which is quite remarkable to what extent we can attribute it to affirmative action, it's not clear. But there has been an expressive cost that has been paid, and this links back to the first question that was asked about, don't affirmative action policies also treat people as non-individuals, as just a race, etc. The other thing it has done in India is create this identity politics where the battle is not between the upper castes and the lower castes. It is between the two lower castes who are fighting for that small part of the pie. Right? So the coalitions are being formed between the lowest of castes and the highest of castes to edge out someone right above you. Right? So there are costs to this, which brings me back to the point that was being made about what facially neutral, facial type top 10% rule programs. And I think one way to conceptualize those is to see them as the flip side of indirect discrimination. So when direct discrimination is prohibited, employers wisen up, right? We can continue doing the same thing, but differently. Let's just not use race, let's use all the other things that relate to it. But affirmative action provisions can be designed in the same way. I think that's probably what Helen was calling smart affirmative action, I like to call it indirect affirmative action, where you have proxies for race or caste or sex, and it will not always work, it depends on the context. When those proxies are available, you reduce the expressive costs of affirmative action policies while securing the benefits to the same ratio of caste groups. So what you do is a reverse of indirect discrimination, and probably at a lower cost. But when that's not possible, of course, we have to engage in direct affirmative action. But that engagement must come with a consciousness that there is a cost to pay, and it must come with some regret on our part.
I want to just take a question that Gay raised about the so-called creamy layer, which was an expression which was used in India. The statement is that people who have that particular protected characteristic, whether a particular caste or whatever it is, do not suffer a disadvantage personally, individually, but are able to bring themselves within that group, based by caste or colour or whatever. Now, Gay, I think you said that you don't have any experience of people in the United States, at least, who have had that experience, because race is such a good predictor, isn't it, of disadvantage in the United States. But I'm wondering whether in, say, the UK context, where, as we've heard, it's everything's quite mixed up. There are lots of predictors of advantage and opportunity, where it's more difficult. It goes back to Hugh Collins' question as well about isn't this question really one of more general socio-economic disadvantage? Are we wrong in focusing on particular protected characteristics when we want to achieve substantial equality? Should we not be focusing on the problem of poverty or disadvantage?
Can I correct?
Okay, please,
Bob.
I'm sorry, Robinson.
Please allow me to state, because I said that I was not convinced that those individuals were not still facing meaningful discrimination. And I was also stating as a separate point that the fact that some individuals in a group achieve greater income does not mean that the work on group-based discrimination has been adequately done. So it's 2 points. There are 2 points there. And I would, if I could, I sort of not been able to add this point. We're talking about in certain societies, some immutable characteristics. You can change somebody's socioeconomic status, and they can walk in this room the next day and be treated as a different person. It doesn't happen with racism. And it doesn't happen with gender. Now, so these are immutable characteristics that it can take generations to actually create the across-the-board equality, group equality, not individuals, for the group, and for the individuals. So, I don't think that we can, first of all, certainly not in the United States. Affirmative action has not had a long enough nor a robust enough experience to judge it well yet. And in no country has that been the case. We're talking about places where there's been generations and generations of discrimination, and there's not going to be a corrective measure that is going to be effective within, a decade or 2 or 3.
Dimitrina, you wanted to put a point.
What you say, Gay, I agree at this very general level that race, even if you are wealthy but belong to the wrong race, you still suffer humiliation. But here we're talking about concrete and specific affirmative action measures. What do you do in this case? You know the situation of Roma in Europe. You've been in all these countries, you know who the Roma are, and you know that there is a huge overlap between ethnicity and socioeconomic disadvantage when it comes to the Roma. You look at Eastern Europe and you say, you can see that one extremely strong difference between Roma and non-Roma is that non-Roma do not go to preschool. Roma do not go to preschool, non-Roma go. This is a huge difference. They do not go to preschool, nursery and preschool, and kindergarten and so on, because they're very poor and because there is a number of ways in which they are excluded: racism, discrimination and so on, segregation, all sorts of conscious discrimination and poverty fused together, difficult to disentangle. You want to put in place a policy. And, for example, you're the government of an East European country. You put a policy which says, let's give preschool allowances to all the Roma. However, maybe 20% of the Roma will be middle and upper class and will be wealthy, and you will create an unfair advantage for that with the political price and the injustice. Would you do that? Or would you have a combination and say, okay, it has to be race, it will be Roma as the criteria, but it will be means tested. So only those who are also economically disadvantaged will get the allowance within the Roma. Fine, but there are many people who are non-Roma, but are poor and have no access to kindergarten, or disabled, dysfunctional families, whatever, who also need that, but do not have. So what do you then do? Do you not end up with having to simply say, in this particular case, it's probably not a racial definition which I need, maybe it's a socioeconomic one. What do you do? So yes, I absolutely agree that that even if you belong to the cream of the cream, if you are in the disadvantaged, generally in the stigmatized group, you still suffer. But how does this translate into specific affirmative action policies when these policies cannot be just general? They're either about higher education or about some kind of measure in some area, and it has to be specific. It has to be tailored to the
I don't know what
disadvantage.
you are saying that I'm saying that. I haven't said that. I haven't said that. But what I would say in response to that very important point is that no country corrects its problems through one program alone. There are many programs that must be put in place to address the problem as it is manifest in different contexts in that society. I would also say that if we just look at universities, for example, universities have many affirmative action programs. They have affirmative action programs for people who are children of people who got degrees before. They have affirmative action programs for people who have different zip codes, as we would say, different parts of the country. So there are many programs going on that advantage different types of populations in the society. So we're not talking about, and many white populations. So there are many programs that exist. So we are, affirmative action really is a measure or a tool that a committed society must use in a lot of different ways, very smartly and context specific, and they have to be very careful to identify the different manifestations of the problem as it exists at different levels and in different sectors of the society.
I think our time is drawing to a close. I'm just going to ask Kate and Helen if they would like to make any comment on any of this generally and specifically.
Well, what I can say is that in the South African context, affirmative action is a hugely emotional issue. And I think it is in many parts of the world. And one of the reasons it's emotional is that quite hardwired, I think, into many of our cultural expectations are expectations of just even treatment. You take 2-3-year-old kids and give one of them a crunchie and don't give it to the other kid. And I can tell you, I would be willing to bet that in pretty well every society across the world, the other kid's going to say, "What about me?" And that's a really deep-seated, and I think it's actually quite a principle of fundamental justice, actually. I think it's distributive justice, quite deeply wired. And one of the problems about affirmative action is it starts, I think, for very good reasons, playing around with notions of distributive justice in ways which people get very emotional and upset about. So that's the first thing I want to say. And secondly, we haven't really, well, it's very much a South African question, perhaps, but maybe also a question in the US, which is the really tough questions, I think, that courts are going to have to face in South Africa. And it's very interesting that here we are 20 years in with really a completely rich range of affirmative action in our society. We've had one case in the Constitutional Court, and frankly, it was an easy one. There's another one pending now, which has been argued but not handed down, much tougher, and there's a much tougher one coming. So it's going to be very interesting to see the way the court's going to deal with it. But the tough question is really, what are the limits you should place on affirmative action, recognizing that people who are now excluded under systems of affirmative action have themselves got their own genuine dignity to be treated properly and fairly and as respected members of the society. How do we draw those lines? When do we say, actually, you've gone too far? And that's the hard question that the South African Constitutional Court is going to have to answer. And it's also going to be very context-driven. I think one of the things we've talked about today is there's a great difference between what you do about preschools, what you do about university admissions, and how you decide who government should contract with. These are very different contexts. And I think it would be unfortunate if the court decides that it shouldn't, and it doesn't deal with it in very contextual ways.
Thank you. Helen?
Well, I know you're much more critical of the public sector equality duty than I am, and I have my criticisms of it and certainly the way it's applied. But one of the things that I think is good about it is forcing open debates about what the sources of disadvantage are, because I think the problem is in British society is that the people who have advantage regard it as natural, and they think it would be nice to share that fairly with people who they can see don't have it, but they assume their own advantage is fair and natural. And I have an anecdote about this, which was sitting next to a judge at the theatre who was being nice to me and said, "Did you see they've just appointed a lot more women?" And it wasn't a judge, I wasn't at the theatre with him, I just happened to sit next to him. And but he said, "Did you see that they have appointed a lot more women in the High Court or the Court of Appeal?" But I think it's very important we go on appointing on merit, because otherwise people will not feel that they're there on merit, and that isn't what women want. And I think it is. The answer to that is yes. It's very important. It's very important that we have more equality in the court, because otherwise the people who are there ought to feel, assuming that talent is equally distributed between the genders and races, we are not here on merit. How undignified for us. So I think if you can start to open that debate up, and then you say, so it can't be fair, can it? So what can we do to make it fair? Then you can open up that debate, and it is otherwise a difficult one for people to have. It challenges them.
I think the Judicial Appointments Commission I saw recently has put diversity as something that relates to merit. In other words, that it's in general interest that you should have a judiciary that is more representative of the population, and that you are entitled to take account of gender. It doesn't mean it's the only factor, but it's that there's been some progress, I hope. We haven't seen the results yet. And may I just make comment on the public sector equality duty? My criticism is that it's bureaucratized because of the emphasis on procedures. Have due regard, therefore do the tick boxes, and you've done the duty. The aim is to change things, and therefore the test that was proposed but not accepted, are you taking proportional measures? And then you could examine the substance of it. But that's a matter for the future. Well, I feel enormously privileged to have heard all the panel and some of the people in the audience make their comments. I think that the international range is quite staggering, and I've learnt a lot, and I'm sure everybody here has learnt a lot from the discussion tonight. This will go on, this discussion, because affirmative action in one form or another is going to be tried probably on an increasing scale throughout the world. So thank you all very much for your participation, and now is the opportunity to continue the discussion over a buffet supper, or if you prefer, go and watch some football. Thank you very much. It was interesting. Just having presentations.
Absolutely, And this time, I think it's great.
I'm glad to see so many trustees.
Yes, so those who didn't make it,
And the answer is
she's not only according to the Constitution, but according to my deepest, deep felt resentment, because she didn't say to